You ever heard of being at the right place at the right time? Well, Thomas Jefferson didn't really want to be at the Second Continental Congress, but he was there anyway. He didn't care to write the Declaration of Independence. It really wasn't that big a deal, but he wrote it anyway. And in the end, he didn't really like the way it came out, but he signed it anyway. This is the incredible story of how Thomas Jefferson became the accidental author of the Declaration of Independence. Now, we're going to start in June 1775. Thomas Jefferson is just taking a stroll through his massive plantation in Virginia called Monticello when he gets the news. His cousin, Peyton Randolph, is coming back home from the Second Continental Congress, and Jefferson has to shoot over to Philadelphia to take his spot. Now, the news itself it's not exactly shocking, right? Jefferson had already been picked as the backup delegate, the bench warmer, the replacement delegate, in case one of Virginia's leaders had to come back home from the Continental Congress. But still, Jefferson isn't exactly thrilled to do it. Anyway, he packs his bags and he starts a brutal 10-day journey to Philadelphia. And when he finally gets there, he is not happy at all. Number one, he's really a quiet family guy and he misses his family. Number two, he hates big cities, so he doesn't really care to be in Philadelphia. And number three, he is terrified of public speaking. And so the idea of being stuck in a room with 60 guys giving speeches, it's not exactly his idea of a good time. Now, Jefferson knows he's not going to be giving any fancy speeches at the Continental Congress, and it turns out he doesn't give a single one. But he figures he will be doing some writing. And the very first thing he does after getting a place to stay, finding a place to stay, is that he asks his new landlord, who happens to be a well-known cabinet maker in Philadelphia, to build him a custom portable lap desk that Jefferson himself had designed. Anyway, just 5 days after getting into town, Congress gives Jefferson his very first writing assignment. Congress, the week before, had created a Continental Army and they sent George Washington up to Boston to fight the British. And so they figured, you know what, we should probably explain to the world why we're doing all this stuff. And so they asked Jefferson and John Dickinson, who's a delegate from Pennsylvania, to write what they call the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. And Jefferson and Dickinson write this document where they basically say, look, guys, we're fighting just to defend ourselves. We don't want war. We don't want independence. All we want is a little respect. And hopefully, at the end of all this, we can just go back to being part of the British Empire and being on good terms with the British king. They say, we mean not to dissolve that union which has so long and so happily subsisted between us, and which we sincerely wish to see restored. Now, a year later, after a year of fighting, that whole tone changes. At this point, some delegates are just fed up and they're like, you know what? We want independence. And so on June 7th, 1776, a delegate from Virginia named Richard Henry Lee proposes for the very first time that the colonies should declare independence from Great Britain. He submits what's called the Lee Resolution. Now, this is it. This is the whole thing. The Lee Resolution. It's basically a one-liner scribbled on a piece of paper, but that one line is very important. It says that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown. Now, this is a huge deal. It's the first time anyone formally proposes independence from Great Britain. And so the leaders in Congress, they know that the delegates, some of them, are going to have to go back home and listen to their colonial governments and kind of get some instruction on how to vote on this thing, right? And so they say, okay, we're going to push the vote 3 weeks, July 1st. We're going to vote on July 1st. So in the meantime, delegates, figure it out, go back home, talk to your governments, but we're voting on July 1st. And in the meantime, just in case this thing passes, I mean, we can't declare independence with a one-liner, right? It's like ending your marriage with a text message. And so they create immediately a committee of five delegates to write a more formal declaration declaring independence and explaining why the colonies are breaking off from Great Britain. Now, this committee of five has some pretty heavy hitters. You've got Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania. You've got John Adams from Massachusetts. The reality is either one of these guys could have written the Declaration of Independence, but it wasn't viewed as that big a deal, right? So they wanted to do more important stuff. Benjamin Franklin wanted to help write the state constitution for Pennsylvania. John Adams wanted to focus his energies on the speech that he wanted to give July 1st. He figured that people would remember the speeches, not some, silly declaration. So they asked Thomas Jefferson to go ahead and write the declaration, which he does. He just kind of rips through it. He knocks out his declaration in 2 or 3 days. And then he goes back to what he thinks is more important stuff, including trying to find a way to get out of Philadelphia. So he writes to Virginia's top political leader, begging him to send someone to replace him, right? He says, look, I got to go back home, probably to be with his sick wife. But he says, look, I got to go back home. Please send someone here to replace me. He says, the situation of my domestic affairs renders it indispensably necessary that I should solicit the substitution of some other person here in my room. But Jefferson's call isn't exactly answered, and so he's still stuck in Philadelphia on July 1st when they take up the vote on independence. So July 1st rolls around, they go around the room, everybody gives their fancy speeches, not Jefferson, on independence, for it, against it, etc. And then they go around the room again and they take like an informal poll, an informal vote on how they would vote on independence. And there's a big problem because 2 of the colonies, Pennsylvania and South Carolina, vote against independence. A 3rd colony, Delaware, is split on the question of independence. Its delegates are literally split, and so it can't support independence. And a 4th colony, New York, they still haven't received instructions from back home, so they can't support independence. And the leaders at the Continental Congress are like, you know what? Why don't we just vote on this tomorrow? And they push the vote off for another day. July 2nd rolls around, and what do you know? Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Delaware, they all flip their votes and they support independence. And so when the vote is taken, it's a unanimous vote in favor of independence. It's a huge deal. And so John Adams writes to his wife immediately saying, this is amazing. What's happened here is incredible. And future generations of Americans will remember this day, July 2nd, as the birthday of America. Well, he was off, of course, by 2 days. Why? Well, because Congress, even though they voted to declare independence July 2nd, they still needed to vote on the final document declaring independence. So they pull out Jefferson's declaration and they spend 2 days just ripping through it. They remove 25% of Jefferson's text and spend, again, 2 days just editing this document before approving it on July 4th, 1776. And while that whole thing is going on, Jefferson is sitting there quietly, horrified that these guys are just ripping apart his declaration. He writes immediately to a friend saying, these guys, man, they mangled the manuscript. I mean, they destroyed my document. So he's not exactly thrilled when the document is approved, and he goes back to just trying to get out of Philadelphia. He writes again to a friend of his, begging his friend to come replace him at the Continental Congress so he can go back home. He says, for God's sake, for your country's sake, and for my sake, come to Philadelphia. I'm under a sacred obligation to go home. This time, Jefferson's wish is granted. He gets his replacement candidate or his replacement delegate, and he's allowed to go home. So he rides furiously off to back to Monticello. He doesn't look back, and he never returns to the Continental Congress. But Jefferson was there when it mattered the most. He was there to author one of America's most important and sacred documents, and he was there for those critical 96 hours from July 1st to July 4th, 1776, where these colonies went from not being able to agree on the question of independence to somehow becoming the United States of America. That transformation came with a little drama, but we'll cover that in the next video. What's up, guys? Thank you so much for watching. Do me a favor, if you haven't already, hit that like button, please subscribe, and hit the notification bell to find out when we upload new videos.